As the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination approaches tomorrow, many are reflecting on their memories of that day. Justin Gick joins us now with more. Justin?
Monica, I caught up with a Bismarck man who has collected Kennedy memorabilia over the years, but also has an interesting perspective on the Kennedy assassination. Rick Collin is a presidential historian, but has a very deep interest in John F. Kennedy. He grew up in the Washington, D.C. area at the time of Kennedy's assassination. He says being close to all of that really impacted him, eventually leading to a strong interest in politics and history. As he reflects over 60 years since the assassination, Collin says that moment in history has resulted in the enduring appeal of John F. Kennedy.
He was a very inspirational president. He was the man who set the goal to get us to the moon before the end of the 1960s. And at the time he set the goal, it was, are you kidding me? But we did it with 5 months to spare. He was the man who established the Peace Corps, which is still going strong today.
Collin says Kennedy inspired a lot of hope in a lot of people, and of course that hope was cut down in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Now coming up on First News at 6, I'll have more on Rick Collin's memories and a special item he cherishes that he received from First Lady Jackie Kennedy after the assassination.
Tomorrow marks 60 years since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas.
Many can remember where they were when they heard the news. Justin Gick caught up with a Bismarck man who remembers that day and joins us with more. Justin?
Monica Allen, Rick Collin is a presidential historian, but perhaps one of his favorite topics to dive into is the Kennedy assassination. And though 60 years have passed, Collin says he's more interested than ever. At his Bismarck home, Rick Collin is reminiscing on a day that forever changed American history, the Kennedy assassination. Collin was only 8 years old at the time and was living in the Washington, D.C. area where his father worked at NASA headquarters. He remembers being at school and hearing the news announced over the loudspeaker that the president had been shot and then later that he had died. Collin and his family lived only 8 miles from Andrews Air Force Base where Air Force One is housed. Collin can remember the news tracking Air Force One's arrival that night and what he and his family did when it was getting close to landing.
It was about 6 o'clock at night, dusk. My brother, 14-year-old brother, and me, 8 years old, we went out on our front yard and we watched Air Force One fly over the house. You can still see those red lights flashing as it got ready to land at Andrews Air Force Base, and that's a powerful memory I've never forgotten.
Although he was only a child, Collin understood the severity of the situation. He remembers all of the 24/7 news coverage in the days following the assassination and watching the funeral. He also remembers watching when Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred to the county jail in Texas.
We were getting ready to sit down to a fried chicken dinner, and Dad said, let's take a break here before we start eating. I want to see what's going on. We went out in the living room, we watched that, and we saw Oswald shot to death on live television. And that was unbelievable.
Collin has collected many pieces of Kennedy memorabilia over the years, but perhaps the one item he cherishes the most is a card First Lady Jackie Kennedy sent him after he wrote condolences to her. Although he can't remember what the letter said, Collin remembers he just had the urge to send one after all the events that transpired. He never thought he would get a response back.
My entire family was surprised when we got this response from Jackie Kennedy, and we were very impressed. It's like, with all the things she's dealing with and all the letters that she had gotten, that my little 8-year-old boy's letter would be one of those that she'd respond to.
As time went on, Collin got more and more interested in all things Kennedy. He says he thinks living in the D.C. area and being around all of that really impacted him. He can remember getting involved with a group called STICA, which was students who investigate the investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
We lobbied Capitol Hill for a reopening of the investigation. We like to think that our lobbying helped contribute to that reopening, which did take place about a year after we started in 1976-77.
Collin says as the Kennedy assassination reaches its 60th anniversary, he thinks it still interests people today for many reasons. One in particular being the what-if factor.
You know, he was running, just gearing up for re-election and running again. He wanted to get a second term, and of course he was killed. So there's that big question. What would he have done with civil rights? What would he have done with Vietnam? Would these issues that played out as they did been different with Kennedy?
These questions will never be answered. Some will just have to hold on to what was. Yeah, and Monica, coming up tomorrow on our cast, I will have a two-part special on the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, speaking to former U.S. Secret Service agent and North Dakotan Clint Hill about his recollections of that fateful day in Dallas.
Today marks 60 years since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Justin Gick is here with a special report on the events of that day. Justin?
November 22nd, 1963. It's a day that's etched into many of our memories. No one remembers this day better than former U.S. Secret Service agent, North Dakota native Clint Hill. Now 91 years old, Hill can still remember everything like it happened yesterday. He says the whole point of the Texas trip was for publicity, as Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon Johnson were setting their eyes on the 1964 election. November 22nd, 1963 started out as a routine day for Hill. The President and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy had stayed overnight at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth after a full day of events. That morning, President Kennedy gave a speech outside of the hotel. The President then attended a breakfast within the hotel, which Mrs. Kennedy was not going to attend. Hill said the plans changed as one of the President's agents called and said the President wanted her downstairs immediately.
So I went and explained to Mrs. Kennedy that she was going to breakfast at the request of her husband. And she understood. And so down we went to the breakfast.
Hill says the President and First Lady then departed Fort Worth to travel a short distance to Dallas's Love Field on Air Force One. Aboard the aircraft, Hill and other agents were going over last-minute details of the day's events.
Going over the surveys that are prepared by the agents. You know, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen there, who's involved.
Hill says earlier in the morning it had been raining. However, it had cleared up, meaning the presidential limo could have the top down. As Air Force One landed in Dallas, the sun was shining and there was not a cloud in the sky. The aircraft taxied to its spot, and then the President and Mrs. Kennedy emerged.
The reason that they wanted that arrival at Love Field in Dallas is reporters, politicians wanted that shot of President and Mrs. Kennedy coming off Air Force One in Dallas.
The President and First Lady greeted crowds at the airport, then took their places in the presidential limo to begin the motorcade through downtown Dallas en route to a luncheon at the Trade Mart. Hill says when they got to Main Street, more than 1,000 people were on hand to view the motorcade. People were hanging out of the windows and standing on top of buildings.
The driver of the presidential car was keeping the limousine to the left-hand side of the street. That took the president, who was in the right rear seat, away from the crowd on the right, but it put Mrs. Kennedy right up next to the crowd on the left. So I would get up on the back of the car that President and Mrs. Kennedy were riding in, to be as close to them as I could be.
As the motorcade continued on, the crowds began to thin, and Hill stayed at his position on the follow-up car. They then made a left onto Elm Street, which was the last section of the parade route before getting on the expressway. Hill was scanning an overpass ahead of them when all of a sudden he heard something that sounded like a gunshot. That began a series of events that are seared into the minds of the American people. We'll have part 2 of our interview with Clint Hill tonight on First News at 6.
On First News at 5, we introduce the first part of retired Secret Service agent Clint Hill's account of the Kennedy assassination on the 60th anniversary. Justin Gick is back for the final part. Justin?
Monica, Hill talked about what he did after he heard the first shot fired and what transpired throughout the rest of that day. Hill turned toward the noise and then back to the limo where he saw Kennedy react.
And I jumped when I realized that he had doing this, and he must have been hit. There must have been a gunshot. So I jumped from my position and started to run to the presidential vehicle to get up on top to form a barrier there to protect both President and Mrs. Kennedy.
As Hill ran to the limousine, he heard another shot and debris flew toward him and Mrs. Kennedy.
And she starts to get up on the back of the car. Well, I'm trying to get up on the back from the rear. And I finally do, and I get a hold of her and put her back in the seat. And when I did that, the president fell to his left, into her lap. I realized it appeared to me that he was dead for sure.
Hill turned to the follow-up car and gave the other agents a thumbs down and yelled at the limo driver to get them to Parkland Hospital. The whole ride over, Hill created a barrier over top the president and Mrs. Kennedy. He says the whole car was quiet on the way over, except for the times when he heard Mrs. Kennedy speak to her husband.
Mrs. Kennedy had said, oh, Jack, what have they done? I loved you, Jack. That's as much as I heard her say.
When they arrived at Parkland, Hill and others expected there to be gurneys awaiting their arrival. However, there wasn't, and agents had to go in and retrieve them. The next thing they had to accomplish was getting Texas Governor John Connally out of the limo and inside. Finally, they were able to get to the president.
Mrs. Kennedy had a hold of him. She wouldn't let it go. So I pleaded with her. I said, please, Mrs. Kennedy, let us help the president. No reaction whatsoever.
Hill says doctors did their best to save the president, but he was declared dead at 1 p.m. Central Time, just a half hour after the shots were fired. Hill says the ride back to Air Force One was silent. When they arrived back at Love Field, the president's casket was then unloaded.
We, the agents, carried the casket up the steps to Air Force One, the rear door, to put it in that section of the aircraft.
Mrs. Kennedy followed behind and sat right beside it. Before they could take off, Hill says they waited for a federal judge to arrive and swear in President Lyndon Johnson. Once they arrived in Washington, Hill says Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy came on board to accompany Mrs. Kennedy off the plane.
People at Andrews were smart enough to put a hydraulic lift there to allow us to move the casket down instead of carrying it down a ramp or stairway. And that worked out very well.
Hill says after the casket was placed in the ambulance, they continued to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the president's autopsy. He says it was a late night and they didn't get back to the White House until a little after 4 a.m., where an honor guard met them and accompanied them inside. The casket was placed in the East Room at the White House, and Hill was finally able to go home for a short time, but a sense of guilt continued to hang over him.
I was starting to feel guilt that I hadn't been able to do more than I did. That's what was really starting to bother me. And over the years, it just grew and grew and grew.
60 years later, Hill still feels that guilt, and the events from that day still haunt him. He has only recently been able to speak about what happened. With the 60th anniversary, Hill says the only new things that have emerged are more conspiracy theories and people coming forward with information that he is skeptical about.
Reading the statements of people who were in the know, nurses, doctors, people from the hospital. If you read all of it, you're going to find out, you'll get a true story.
Hill says 60 years later, the assassination of President Kennedy still teaches us the same thing, which is you never know what is around the next corner, and that you may think you have everything covered, but they didn't that day.
You really must be as cautious as possible and take every thing you can do to protect a person in that position, the president. You don't want to go through another one of those.
Hill continues to share his story and recently released a 60th anniversary reprint of his book 5 Days in November with a new afterword. A documentary on his life will be coming out in 2024 called Agent Number 9, The Clint Hill Story. Many see Clint Hill as a hero that day for his actions, but he says he does not feel like one. When I asked how he would like to be remembered one day, he simply said that he tried.